Hey, how do you feel about some high rarity cards, or maybe some foreign ones, or maybe be ahead of the game with others by preparing for future set releases with very quick shipping? Check out EJ Gaming and use code British5 on checkout for 5% off on all your orders. Link in the description.
Greetings, duelists, and welcome to another video. So, today I want to talk about trap cards and their position in the format because in 2024 we will be receiving a few new cards, and I personally feel like these cards that we're going to receive are going to change how trap cards are being played in the metagame throughout the foreseeable future. I just want to give you a brief history of trap cards as a whole, trap cards in general, and what Konami is trying to do, or at least the Yu-Gi-Oh is been trying to be done with trap cards as a whole, as a category. I don't think it comes to a surprise that trap cards are the weakest category out of the three categories that we have between spell and monsters and traps. Monsters and spells are just a lot easier to use. We have enough monsters and enough spell cards in the game. They just serves as extra utility, and they're just very better at playing in the tempo than trap cards. Trap cards are good mid to late game, but in the very early game, monsters and spells are going to do the job better than trap cards can. So to circumvent that, we've been receiving a couple of cards that just serve a purpose of just facilitating the use of trap cards and just making sure so we can keep up in the meta game with the other two categories. We've been receiving trap cards that just try to use the effect of other trap cards or tutor other trap cards. For example, Trap of Darkness is the first one that we received. Then we had stuff like Trap Trick and Trap Track. We also been receiving trap cards that just serve as a function if they are blown up by your opponent. So essentially, the function of those trap cards are to just punish your opponent, like Boo Boo Game and Waking the Dragon. And then we have trap cards that just try to high roll the game if you are keeping your tempo with your already established trap cards, that being stuff like Labyrinth Barrage. Now that we talked about the category of normal traps that just help tutor other traps or just serve a function if they're interacted with your opponent in some way, now we'll talk about another category of traps. We have the category of traps that just have very, very potent effects that can just linger throughout the turn and just swing the tempo of the game on their own right. We have floodgate traps like the Shiranui Saga and Dimensional Barrier, while we also have traps like the Ruma Karma Cannon. We have a lot of other trap cards that fit into these categories, like trap hole cards, like the Mirror Force cards, cards like those in general. But I am pressed for time, and that category is almost infinite. But throughout this game, we've been receiving a lot of traps, and now we're going to receive two cards that's going to evolve the way we play trap cards again. And we're going to talk about the first one right here. The first one we're going to talk about is this trap called Transaction Rollback. So what does Transaction Rollback do? The first effect says, pay half your life points, then target one normal trap in your opponent's graveyard, except Transaction Rollback. This effect becomes that normal traps effect when that card is activated. So essentially, this card is a reverse version of Trap of Darkness. Instead of just targeting your own graveyard, you're targeting your opponent's graveyard. However, there is a second effect. You can banish this trap from your graveyard and pay half your life points. Then target one normal trap in your graveyard except Transaction Rollback. This effect becomes that normal traps effect when that card is activated. You can only use one Transaction Rollback effect per turn and only once that turn. This is a really big deal because this trap pretty much fits into the category of your tutoring trap cards as well as your graveyard trap cards. So having trap cards accessible throughout your graveyard is very, very, very important because it pretty much puts you in the pace of your opponent if you have ways to tutor out your trap cards and getting them to the graveyard. Another thing about transaction rollback that is really, really strong is that it pretty much punishes your opponent for trying to contest against your normal trap cards or your trap cards in general if you were to be playing like a trap heavy strategy. Those are decks like Trap Tricks, Labyrinth, Unchained, Eldritch, just to name a few uh, just like a few examples. So, how can we use transaction rollback? Uh, the first example of categories that we can use is, as I mentioned earlier, you just play a trap heavy deck that just fits into this category. That would be stuff like Trap Tricks and Labyrinth, just to give you a prime example. So that's what the OCG has been doing as of late. Labyrinth is a really top tier contender in the OCG, and one of the main reasons is because of their interaction with transaction rollback. Here in the TCG, Labyrinth is already a top tier strategy. You can pretty much put them on like top 5 decks in the game at the moment, and transaction rollback is just going to like help bolster this strategy a lot more. So, what is the second best use of transaction rollback, or what category of decks would you be playing it at? The second category would be decks or archetypes that involve milling or just sending cards to the graveyard. So we're looking at stuff like Tearlaments, and we can look at any deck that can just summon cards that involve milling, such as like Beatrice. Those decks are like, for example, are like Virtual World and Drytron, just to name a few. So any deck that can have access to Beatrice or any deck that can mill cards in general is going to have a huge benefit of transaction rollback, because essentially what this means is you are tutoring a way into you using your normal traps without your opponent having the ability to interact with them outside of the graveyard. So, on that regard, transaction rollback is really, really strong. I feel like whichever deck can benefit or abuse this card the best way possible is going to have a very, very significant advantage. And it's not even because of these normal trap cards you see right here, because the normal trap card category is very, very stacked. Like in Labyrinth's case, you have like your welcome traps, which is part of your already established archetype. In the case of something like Tearlaments, you can use other trap cards like your already normal traps like Tearlaments Meta Noise and Needlebug Nest, other cards that can just help fuel your graveyard. On Trap Trick's case, you have your whole trap cards, and that's just to name you and not just like a small example of everything you can do with just transaction rollback. So once this card is released, I can assure you right now, I feel like the format is going to be changing into a format that can very, very utilize this card. I feel like decks that can play this card very optimally are going to have a very significant advantage, because essentially what this means is you have trap cards now at the pace of monsters and spell cards, as long as you can tutor them out directly. So now that we talked about transaction rollback and like its benefit and its place in the format, let's talk about the other category of trap card, because this is in the tutor trap category. Now we're going to talk about a trap that fills in the impact category. The trap that we're going to talk about is this one right here. is called Rumpel Teufel. So what does Rumpel Teufel do? First effect, declare a monster card name. Neither player can special summon monsters with that original name for the rest of this turn, except from the graveyard. So if you're familiar with Side Blocker and Prohibition, this card is very, very similar to that. However, it just prevents the monster from being summoned. Now let's read the other effect. You can banish this card from your graveyard and declare one monster card name. Neither player can activate the effects of monsters on the field with that original name for the rest of this turn. You can only use one Rumpel Teufel effect per turn and only once that turn. So what does this mean? Essentially, you have a trap card that can be used both on the field and in the graveyard, which is the first thing that we need to talk about. The second thing that we need to talk about is that this card pretty much like shuts down a specific monster, and that is a very, very, very big deal because we're in a format that is super diverse, and this card is really, really strong for people that are very knowledgeable at the game. Let's say, for example, you're playing against Rika plants, like the Sonavolon plant deck, and you just flip this card and just call Aroma Seraphic Jasmine, or you just call Sunseed Genius Loci. You call it in response to like an activation of Unexpected Die, for example. Essentially, what it means is they can no longer special summon that monster once this card resolves. If you're in a position where your opponent is trying to summon a specific monster and you don't want that monster to be summoned, you can pretty much just flip this card, call out the monster's name, and that card that your opponent was activating just does not resolve properly. In the graveyard, this card is also phenomenal because essentially in the following turn, or in the turn you didn't activate the first effect, if this card is already in your graveyard, let's say your opponent already successfully summons a monster, or your opponent is about to summon a monster and you don't want to deal with that monster on the board, you just banish the strat card, call the monster's name, and essentially you just stop them for the turn. This card is also very strong as a reactive trap because if your opponent already has an established board but they have a monster that you don't want to deal with, you can just banish this trap card and essentially you stop that monster from using their effects. Also, to note, this card affects the player and it does not affect the monster itself, so it bypasses unaffected monsters like Expertly Noir and Chaos Angel, just to name a few examples. So now that we talked about these two trap cards, what do you think will happen to the format? I really think these two trap cards are very, very strong. One of them comes out in Maze of Memories, which is in January, and the next one shows up in Phantom Nightmare, which is our next main set that's going to be on February. I feel like once these two cards are released, unless Konami addresses like trap cards as a whole or like trap strategies like Labyrinth, you will be seeing those decks probably do very successful in the future because these are very impactful trap cards and they really serve an like evolution of what Konami wants us to do with trap cards in general. It kind of shows you that Konami really is doing their best to make sure that all category of cards are just as strong one with the other. Like spell cards and monster cards have been the main form of utility and disruption for players for many years, and it's not because trap cards are bad in general, it's more because trap cards need stronger cards to like keep up with the pace of the game, and these are very, very good example of cards that just do that. That's it from me. I hope you found this video informative and to your liking and understanding. Keep practicing and keep dueling.